Thank you for having me. My name is Michael Fischer. We're talking about DB DAO here, and it's basically like a database that's sort of built on chain using IPFS, and I think will be very helpful for bacalao and compute over data. And what I wanted to talk about particularly today was, data DAOs and a DAO and decentralized science in particular, because I think that's one area in oh, is that Tamir? Okay. Okay. So I think there's okay. So I want to talk about data DAOs and decentralized science in particular. So decentralized science stands for how to do like science on the blockchain and how to generally accelerate science and how to use the blockchain for things like funding, for things like data reproducibility, for storing data, for publishing, and all these types of things. So I just want to give you a slight background on myself. Yeah, the first is like the goals of DeSci to me is primarily to accelerate science. So right now, science is very slow and traditionally done in academic settings like a university and it's very hierarchical in many ways. But what's cool about decentralized science is that you have the ability to use a meritocratic system like the blockchain in order to create new data and to create science and to create new information. And so I'm really, I just finished a PhD actually, and the PhD was wonderful, but I just saw so many ways in which we could do science in a more interesting and more inclusive and probably more reproducible way. So, I mean, one of the problems right now we're having with science is there's a reproducibility crisis because experiments aren't necessarily by default created in ways that anybody can run or anyone can. It's like sort of like a GitHub project. Like a GitHub project that you can download and run anywhere with lots of stars is very reproducible. But one that sort of only runs sometimes or that only one or two people know how to do isn't necessarily super useful. And I think we're sort of facing the same thing with science. So like in science, if there's only one paper and no one else can replicate it, there's an issue. And I think the blockchain can help solve these problems by creating from the ground up ways to create experiments and create analysis that are reproducible across many things. And then science should sort of be by default inclusive. You shouldn't have to, you should be able to put a pull request into a science project or audit a piece of data that exists on chain and say like, hey, this thing doesn't quite work with when I tried it out. And with a traditional paper, there's no sort of back and forth, but with using the blockchain, there's an open naming system and a way for many people to engage. And then also with DeSci that I think is really cool is that it doesn't have to compete with traditional science. What we're seeing is that there's all these different new things like things on psychedelics, things on cannabis, things on aliens, things on nutrition, things on hair loss, and things that aren't necessarily studied in depth or within traditional space, in traditional academic spaces. And we're seeing that maybe there's a way to do that in DeSci to find these new topics. And then I wanted to also say a little bit about, one thing that also is important about DeSci is that there's this movement of open science, and open science is about, I publish my data on the block online, and then maybe other people look at it, but I don't ever receive any sort of credit. It's just sort of someone being very generous and giving away their data or giving away their research. But what I think is really cool about the blockchain and about DeSci is now we have this mechanism, the blockchain, to incentivize people to share their data or incentivize people to get credit for things using DIDs and a distributed identity and tokens. So now what we're doing is like we have this open science primitive, but we're able to use the blockchain to sort of incentivize people in a good way to share or to be beneficial to society. And so what we're going to be talking about today is how people can share data in these concepts of a data DAO. And I'll first just give you a quick example of what it looks like and how it's built and where it's being used, and then we can go into more detail on some of the other parts. So this is built on top of IPFS, and it's basically sort of similar to Airtable. And so say we wanted to collect all the butterflies in the world. Like we wanted to catalog where all these ones are coming from. And we have like a butterfly DAO. So what we do is we have all the butterflies. We have a DAO that's dedicated to this. So we first create a butterfly table in this DB DAO. And we create a column here called species. And then what we see here is there's this one column called NFT, there's another column called Block Explorer, and there's another column called IPFS. So what you can do here is we'll create a form for this piece of data, for this spreadsheet, and we'll call it butterflies of the world, a butterfly form. And then we'll share that out to all the people who are in our DAO. And then, so they fill it out. They say, I'm from Santa Cruz, so I would fill out Monarch, and I push that there. And then what we see here is it automatically mints a row. When it mints a row, it automatically puts it on OpenSea. So what's actually going on underneath the hood here is when you add a column to this database or to this table, it's storing it on IPFS. And then it's taking that CID and it's putting that inside an NFT. And then that NFT is given to the person that contributed the data. And that person is now the owner of that NFT. But what's really cool, and it's also, you can see it's running on Avalanche. So that NFT is stored on Avalanche, and it's also the actual data is stored on IPFS. So right now it's a JSON object, but you can also store videos or anything. But what's really cool is now what we have this sort of amalgamation of NFTs that are in this database. So where is this being used? So one of the things that's very cool is it's being used in HairDAO. So what is HairDAO? So HairDAO had this really cool insight that there hasn't been a lot of innovation in hair loss. And people have finasteride or other drugs like that, but there hasn't been a lot of research in it. But there are large online communities like Reddit that have these large subreddits of people that are interested in trying to solve hair loss and are doing a lot of self-experimentation. But a lot of this data is just sort of being lost. Like it's in Reddit forums and people replying to each other. So what they had this thing is they said, what if we empowered all these people who are doing hair loss research sort of on their own? And what if we sort of bring them all into a DAO and we test out some of these drugs in a more systematic way? We can probably do distributed clinical trials or distributed trials in a way that is much cheaper than what could be done otherwise, and more ground up as well. So they created this very interesting patient portal here, where you can upload your genome and you can upload which drug you are taking and pictures of your hair and other information about your gender and age. And that's all stored on IPFS and an NFT. So that user gets to hold that piece of data. Now, what's interesting is now you can do all these sort of distributed compute things on top of this. Now that with things like Bacalao. So another thing is like Altaflora. So this is another decentralized science project. And they had this insight that people have found that when you give kids CBD, it helps to reduce epilepsy. And they wanted to do a clinical trial on this. And they're integrating with DB DAO to take their sort of existing Web 2 software and make it more Web 3. So instead of just the data being stored directly on a server or on a database, what's happening is that they can hook it into DB DAO to allow for the patients to be holding their own data. So what's so cool about a Web3 database is that we're sort of, people can be incentivized to contribute to a data set. And I heard Juan from Protocol Labs talk about this idea of negatively priced data. So the idea he was describing is it's like when you store data traditionally on something like AWS, you have to pay a little bit of money to store it there. But that's kind of backwards if you think about it, because AWS should really be paying you for that data, because they should be able to make it be useful. That data should be useful, or should be other people should be paying for it. And if you choose to, you should be able to earn money from that instead. And this would be like, instead of negatively priced data, you should be able to have positively priced data. And that's kind of like what we're doing here with DB is people are creating these databases and putting the data in them. And then that data is being sold if they choose to have it on the marketplace. And then when it's sold, that money goes to the people that contributed to the data set. And that's one of the really cool things that separates a Web2 database from a Web3 database, is the ability to make money from it. Secondly is data permanence. So you can keep data alive forever because it's built on IPFS. And you can data composability, so you can now link between different records. So before, you'd have a record on one server, and it wouldn't have a CID, and then you'd have it on there would be a record at University A and a record at University B, but you might want to be able to draw a connection between those things. And with a flat naming architecture, because it's all built on the chain, you can link between these different rows, and you can start to create new data sets from that. And then, of course, people own their data, which is very cool. You can encrypt the data, which is also very cool. And it's tied to your wallet address, which is nice, because then you can start to build reputation and rewards. And reputation within science is very important, because that's basically more or less how science is conducted these days. So what DB DAO does is, you just have one slide. It incentivizes people to contribute. It makes each row in the database, and it makes each row in the database an NFT, which allows for people to monetize these data sets and people to share in the revenue. And what I think this is really cool is it's a drop-in replacement for an existing database, because it uses the same sort of SQL adapters that you have elsewhere. But I think it's interesting to take a step back and say, okay, where's the value created here? And the value is created because one piece of data alone doesn't have a ton of value. But when someone puts together like 100 pieces of data, then all of a sudden this is useful to people, because now you have a well-curated data set that can be useful. And traditionally, this data would just, if you have 1,000 rows, the person who owns that would be able to extract that value. But the insight of DB DAO was that, what if we took that extra value that's created by collecting multiple rows together and gave it back to the people that contributed to the data set initially, which is people which we call the scouts. So here's just a quick example. So say you have like an X-ray, you have here, the people put in their data into the database, people purchase it, and now each row has a predictable outflow of money. And because the data is all tokenized now, you can sort of apply any sort of DeFi protocol to this. So you could take a loan, each NFT is producing a stable cash flow. So you could take a loan based out on that on some DeFi protocol, because a token can be interoperated with any sort of lending platform. Or you could swap it with someone. You could buy or sell it on OpenSea. So it's really cool when you can tokenize data. You can now get access to all the DeFi infrastructure that exists. But there's a question here. So people are putting rows into the database, but what prevents then someone from putting in so many rows and then for them to controlling all of the data in the database? So let's say a data set is producing $100 a month, and I say like, oh, I'm an evil actor. I'm going to put in 1,000 spam rows into that database, and then I'm going to get 99% of that money that comes in. So that's a problem. So what we did is we came up with this idea of like a staking system. So when you want to put a row into the database curator, so the person that starts the database initially, sets a small amount, like $1 or 50 cents or a penny. And when you contribute to the data set, you have to put in along with it a penny. And if your row is accepted into the data set, then you get your penny back. But if your row is rejected from the data set, you lose that penny and it gets slashed. Now, an interesting thing here is like, okay, now, we have this person who, there's another problem, which is the curator of the data set, the person that decides whether or not the row gets accepted or rejected from the database has a lot of power, because they could all of a sudden just start rejecting every single row and taking that small deposit. And the way that you prevent against this is we have this concept of a log chain. So every row that is submitted to the database is on chain, so you can see it. And you can have people look over this log chain and say like, oh, the curator of the database rejected these 3 rows, but I think those should be accepted. And then you can see sort of the honesty of the curator based on the on-chain data. And if you don't trust the curator anymore, you go and start a new database somewhere else. And this is important because a lot of decisions that are made are just inherently like really hard to figure out. Like, say you wanted to create a database of like unbiased news, or like, it's just hard to determine it. So at the end of the day, you need human systems in place to determine who is a good judge of data that should be accepted or rejected from a database. So what is the database curator? We talked a little bit about the curator. What does the database curator look like? So in actuality, the curator is just a multi-sig. And what's cool about this is this gives you a lot of optionality in how curation can be done. So in one case, a curator can just be one person. And the curator is the person that initially started the data set. So in one case, the curator can just be one person, but the curator could be a whole DAO of people, or it could be another model would be like something like Mechanical Turk, where you're just paying people as an element comes in, and it comes in with a small deposit of like 10 cents. Maybe you use 5 of those cents to pay someone on Mechanical Turk who's unbiased, or a crowd, or 2, 3 of 5 people on Mechanical Turk to accept or reject rows. But I think one of the most interesting things I'm excited about is using like an AI to be the curator of a database. So the AI, you could train an AI to like ChatGPT to say, you should accept this row, or you should not accept this row, or you should flag this row for a human to look over. And now you have like a computer being able to quickly resolve or flag certain types of issues. And it's all connected into the blockchain because you give it a key and it can just sign off on these transactions very easily. So I think that's very cool. We can also encrypt certain things. So we have the ability to keep data off chain or move it on chain depending on the user's needs. And that's all built into the user interface. And here's sort of what the business model looks like. So we take 10%, and then the person that curates the data set, who's the database curator, the admin, takes 30%. And I think this is really important because a lot of data sets die because no one's in charge of keeping them up. But if you start paying people for curating the database, the 30%, then you can keep these databases alive. And then, of course, the scouts, so the people that actually contribute the data to the database, get 60% of the rewards. And these numbers can all be sort of changed around at mint time. But this is sort of the general breakdown of how it works. I just want to take one other second. We have, if you are interested in learning more about DeSci, I run DeSci NYC, and we have our next event on May 31st, which you guys are all welcome to. You can actually go to dbdao.xyz, or you can go to desci.nyc. We have that new website, and you can register for our next event at desci.nyc. And of course, we're always looking to reach out or help. So if you want to sign up for an account, you can go to dbdao.xyz. Feel free to drop me a line at go Here's our web address for DeSci NYC. And thank you so much. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Right, okay. So John's question was, is there any work to be done or in progress in connecting DB-DAO to existing journals and publications so that you can find a data set that's being used from a publication or vice versa?
Yeah, so you can generate a view of the data, and we're also working on this thing where you can generate a Merkle root of a specific data set. So what's cool about that is you could then publish that in your paper. And you could say, look, I use this data set with this hash, and here's a link to the data set, and here's a link to the hash. And then put both of those in your paper, and the link to the data set is all sort of gathered from on-chain, from IPFS, and then displayed using DB-DAO or some other thing that basically indexes in the same way we do. But it's open source, so you can recreate it yourself in the future, along with that Merkle root hash that verifies all the data. And if you're interested, I can send me a Telegram here, and I can show you how to do that.
John is nodding profusely.
Excellent.
Any more questions? Yes. Can we get the mic over here?
I'm curious how you do the indexing of all the data. So like every row is an NFT, and you can provide like a graph to actually build up a unified index to the database, or you have your own.
So the question was, how do you do the indexing of all the data? Do you use the graph for that, or do you have your own indexing system?
We have our own indexing system. We could use the graph. The graph just was it just was expensive, and we found a cheaper way to do it. But there's nothing wrong with the graph. But we just had a different way of indexing it. We also we mint the rows as NFTs when you tell us to. So that's like a bit of a parameter within the system. And then what we do is we track when that NFT moves around. So if someone else buys that, if that NFT moves to a different wallet, we then re-update the spreadsheet more or less with where that new wallet, where that new piece of data is living. But we don't use the graph. We use I believe Alchemy for that. Oh, and we also have this one other thing. We also have this thing called DeSci Combinator, which we're doing, which is like a DeSci accelerator program. So if anyone is interested in that, go to scicombinator.xyz. And if your project or your project is looking to get into DeSci, we're happy to help. And it's all built on top of IPFS and Bacalao, so very integrated well into the ecosystem.